When I was growing up, our town had a video rental place that rented video games as well. One of the games that I rented many times from there was the first Final Fantasy on the NES. While it was never a game that we owned, I played it many times and was even able to beat it once or twice while renting it. It was a game that captured my imagination and fostered a love for RPGs early on, along with some other games like the Dragon Warrior Dragon Quest series. I've wanted the chance to play this again on modern systems with the usual upgrades that go along with re-releases. The new Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster series presented a great opportunity to do so. How does the first game in the Final Fantasy series hold up after all these years? Is it a game that I can still enjoy, or has time not been kind to a game that I once loved so much? Let's find out. Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster is a turn-based RPG developed by Square Enix. The Pixel Remaster versions of these games are available on PC, mobile, PlayStation 4, and Nintendo Switch. The PC and mobile versions were released in 2021, while the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch versions were released in 2023. I am playing the PS4 version of the game on a PS5. In comparison, the original released in 1987 in Japan and 1990 in the US. So we're dealing with a game that is only 4 years from turning 40 years old. As a final note, the game is rated E for everyone by the ESRB, so there's not really any questionable material here if you're worried about such things. The story in Final Fantasy is probably a bit lacking by today's standards. On the surface, it feels just kind of generic. A group of heroes, promised by prophecy, come to save a land that is threatened by some mysterious evil. You aren't really told where these heroes come from, as they just kind of appear near the starting city and castle of the game. The opening cutscene says they have journeyed there, but with no evidence of a boat and nobody really recognizing them in any of the towns that you visit later on, it winds up being a bit of a mystery. To add to a feeling of the generic story, your first quest is to rescue a kidnapped princess. However, under the surface of the generic feel is a deeper world. Is it limited by the technology of the day that it was originally made and the lack of a strong narrative? I think it is, but the lore of the world is interesting. It may not make a super strong impression compared to the stories that we have access to today, but when this was released, it felt like a cohesive world that had history and an epic quest to discover. The ancient buildings and civilizations that have been destroyed or lost, the variety of races you run into, and the lore of the elements and four crystals are all pretty interesting aspects of the story. The story even goes weird for the final act and throws in time travel, which isn't my favorite storytelling device, but certainly wasn't an aspect found in many other RPGs of that era. We also now know that this first entry in the Final Fantasy series introduces many elements that would reappear regularly later on in the series. Classes or jobs like Black, White, and Red Mage, Thief, Monk, and Warrior. The whole idea of 4 elemental crystals and 4 elemental fiends, which appears in a number of later games. Characters like Bahamut and weapons like Excalibur, an airship as the best way to travel in a game. All of these are aspects that reappear in many later Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy also starts the series trend of mixing high fantasy with technological advancement. This gives the Final Fantasy series an interesting world where you run into robots as well as packs of goblins with knives. It makes an interesting dynamic that you don't always see, as some things tend to go all one way or another. There's either it's all high fantasy and swords and magic, or it's all kind of sci-fi. Whereas Final Fantasy, even here, which I kind of forgot about, mixes both of them to some degree. Now, while I can't say that the story of Final Fantasy is great, it does work fairly well. It's by no means perfect, and the focus on exploration and figuring out where you need to go next doesn't help make a compelling story. This focus can often lead to major gaps in progressing in the story unless you're using some kind of guide as you're trying to figure out where to go or what to do next. The ideas were good, but the execution makes things feel a bit more uneven, at least looking at it from now. If you've ever played a turn-based RPG, you're probably going to be familiar with the basic gameplay found in Final Fantasy. After all, this was one of the early inspirations for the genre as a whole. In case you haven't played one, I'll give a basic breakdown of what you can be expecting. When you start the game, you'll get to create your party of 4. Final Fantasy allows for you to customize your party. You have 6 different classes that you can pick from, and you can mix and match them any way you like. You can go for a balanced party of melee and magic, a more physical attack power party, or a magic-based party. You can even be particularly hard on yourself and try to do runs with all 4 characters being the same if you like. It's a fun system and allows you to play the game in a number of ways however you see fit. The downside to this level of customization is that your party lacks any characterization. They are all blank slates that that have no personality of their own. This doesn't impact gameplay too much, but it is one of the aspects that makes the narrative side of things a little weaker. Once you get your party set up, you'll have control of your party and be able to explore the land. You're able to go into towns like the one that you start beside. Towns and castles in Final Fantasy are where you can rest at the inn to heal up, buy items, equipment, and spells, and find information about where you need to go next. I should note that if you come to town with one of your party members dead, you need to go to the church to revive them, as a visit to the inn just isn't enough to bring back a dead party member. Information you get in towns and castles and other locations isn't always super straightforward, but pretty much anything that gets mentioned that involves a person or place is probably something you're going to need to look into at least a little bit. Most of the time, you don't have to worry about enemies being in towns. I think there is only one town where you fight pirates when you talk to the captain, but that's the only instance I could think of. The other two places that you'll be exploring are not nearly as safe. That is exploring the overworld and the dungeons of the game. These both have random encounters that will lead you into battles. Dungeons can also have set battles as well, with monsters blocking paths, being in treasure chests, and of course the bosses that you'll have to encounter as well. I know random battles have a bit of a bad reputation today, but I don't always mind them. That said, Final Fantasy's random encounter rate seems a bit high at times. When you're traveling between locations and battling monsters every few steps, it can feel a bit like a slog to get from point A to point B. The remaster does have an ability to turn off encounters, which is nice, but I also didn't completely like to use it either, unless I was really needing to get to a stopping point or was fighting enemies that were just much weaker and was kind of a waste of time for me to be engaging. Battles are turn-based, and at the start of each round of that battle, you'll get to choose the actions for all of your party. You can attack, cast a spell, use an item, defend, or flee. Once you've decided your actions for that turn, you and your enemies will perform them. I tried really hard to see if there was a rhyme or reason to how turn order in battles got decided, but I wasn't really able to figure one out. You'd think that faster members of your party or enemies that, dealt with speed would fight first, but it just seemed more random than that, because sometimes your mages would go first, sometimes your fighters would go first, sometimes your, the thief or the ninja would go quicker. It just really didn't seem to make sense. Speed seemed to more deal with how many attacks you could do than when that attack took place in the battle. So yeah, maybe there's some formula there that I just don't quite know, but it didn't seem like it really had a huge influence on turn order. Using the attack is fairly straightforward. You just pick who you want to attack and you'll hit them with your sword or whatever weapon you have equipped. But the magic system of the game is a bit less so. Magic spells have a few divisions. The first division is that they are divided into two types of magic: white and black. The white mage can learn all of the white magic at least once they get upgraded, and the black mage can learn all the black magic spells. White magic tends to deal more with healing and protection, whereas black magic tends to deal more with offensive spells like fire damage and lightning damage and ice damage and things along that line. Red mages can learn a little bit of both schools of magic. They can learn some white spells and some black spells, but they are a little bit more limited. They aren't able to get any spell that they want from both of those worlds. In addition to that, magic spells are also divided between 8 different levels. You can buy spells at various towns, and early towns will have low-level spells, while towns that you find near the end of the game will have more powerful high-level magic available for purchase. At each of the levels, you can only purchase 3 spells. This can be kind of limited, and I'm not a big fan of this system, but I'm guessing that it was a limitation of the NES and how much data it could kind of hold all at one time. Casting spells is also a bit unique, as this game doesn't have a traditional magic point system. Instead, you are only able to cast so many spells of each level before you have to rest or use an ether to recover. You'll gain more casts and the ability to cast higher level spells as you gain character levels. To be honest, I found the magic system of the game a bit clunky feeling. You can't use all of the spells. Only having so many casts per level of magic felt a little too limiting, and spells also quickly got very expensive, which was also kind of annoying. When you defeat enemies using your attacks and spells, you will receive money and experience points that will level up your characters and make them stronger. You can occasionally get an item from combat as well, but I didn't find that to be too common during the game. You can also run from enemies, but I didn't find that very helpful. I felt that for weak enemies, it took longer to run than it did to just take them out, especially if your running away failed. This is pretty much the standard gameplay you'll be running into: exploring towns, finding clues clues on where to go next, traveling to these locations, battling guys on the way, and if that location is a dungeon, and battling your way through that dungeon, and finding the boss you need to defeat or the item that you need to find inside of it. Doing these things tends to unlock what you need to progress to the next location of the game and kind of do the same cycle over again. Some other things that you'll run into later in your journey are vehicles. Your party will get a ship, a canoe, and eventually an airship. You can still run into enemies while in your ship or on your canoe, but an airship will keep you away from enemies and fully opens up the map for you to explore at that point. Admittedly, the game does its best to make airship landing spots very unhelpful for reaching later game locations. You can only land on certain types of land, and the game loves to make that as far as possible from where you actually need to go. So you can expect a long foot journey from your place that you can actually land your airship to where you need to go in that landmass. It's kind of an annoying thing, but I also get like they don't want to make it too easy and want you to actually be fighting the different guys on the various areas. But at the same time, it was not great either. There's also the ability to upgrade your class in the game as well. This will change the name of your class, so your warrior will change into a knight, your thief will change into a ninja, things like that. It'll make your characters stronger, it'll change the look of your character, and some classes will also be able to learn spells, like the knight can learn some low-level white magic, the ninja can learn some low-level black magic. It also allows your mages to learn some of the most powerful high-level spells in the game. Like the white mage and the black mage that you start with isn't able to learn some of the higher level magic without getting these upgrades later on. There are other features that the Pixel Remaster version of this game adds. There are really quite a few of these little additions. I've already mentioned that you can turn off random encounters in the game, but you can also adjust encounters in other ways as well. You can adjust the amount of money or experience you gain from encounters to make you have less of a grind in places. There's also the addition of an auto battle feature, which will automatically select your party's last actions and will repeat them until the battle is over. While I didn't really adjust the experience or money gain until I beat the game and was cleaning up trophies, I did use the auto battle quite a bit, as I found using it was typically quicker than running away from battles. The features added weren't all related to combat though. The game adds a quick save feature that allows you to save anywhere and not just on the overworld. This was nice since save points weren't a thing in dungeons yet. There's also a dash feature that makes you move quicker in towns and dungeons. To help you navigate the world, a map is available in the upper corner of the screen, both for the overworld and for other locations. None of these change the game overly much, but are helpful little modern additions that can make the game a bit smoother to get through. Overall, I mostly enjoyed the gameplay of Final Fantasy. The encounter rate was maybe a bit on the high side, especially with the game so focused on exploration. This can lead to a lot of battles while trying to figure out where to go next or how to navigate a particular dungeon. While the addition of turning encounters off could help at times, I also felt that relying too much on this would detract from the game overall, and perhaps make you a bit underleveled if you used it too much. I found the auto battle feature to be much more helpful in getting through battles fairly quickly and also allowing you to gain levels and power for later. I also wasn't a huge fan of the magic system in the game. It was unique, and I give it points for that, but it also felt a bit too clunky and restricting. You were limited in how many spells you could have. Spells were also typically really expensive and hard to buy without doing some grinding for money at various stages in the game. It wasn't bad, but it was probably the mechanic that I enjoyed the least. Final Fantasy is an example of fundamental turn-based RPG gameplay. Even though I didn't like some of the aspects to the gameplay, I do overall enjoy turn-based RPGs, and Final Fantasy is no exception. I know that not everyone shares that enjoyment of the genre, and how much you like the genre will probably impact your enjoyment of the game. Now, as the label Pixel Remaster would indicate, this version of Final Fantasy maintains a pixel art style, but one that significantly updates the look of the original. It may not be the best looking version of the first Final Fantasy, but I really enjoy its style. Looking through other images of other versions, the only version that I would say is better looking is the PSP version, but that is not nearly as accessible as this one, and it takes on an almost cartoony style, which maybe makes the game a bit too bright and cheery looking. The Pixel Remaster instead seems to go for trying to recreate many of the sprites from the original game. It does change some things around. I felt like mainly for towns and the way your characters look from other versions, but it does try to stick pretty close to the originals in most of the other ways. There are also a couple options regarding the style of the game. You can also choose from 2 different fonts in the game, which I did wind up changing from the default as I like the classic font a little better. You are also able to put a CRT filter on your screen if you really want to feel that nostalgia, but I wasn't a big fan of that filter to be honest, and so I stuck with the default. Overall, I thought the Pixel Remaster looked really nice and was a great way to pay homage to the original art style of the game, but giving it an updated and polished look for modern audiences. It presents some quality pixel art, and I definitely enjoyed what they created here. Moving on to sound and music, it should come as no surprise that Final Fantasy has amazing music. For the Pixel Remasters, the whole soundtrack has new arrangements which sound really nice. If you're wanting that old school vibe though, there is an option to change the soundtrack to the original. I think this is a great option so that people can choose the soundtrack that they want in the game. While switching to the old soundtrack did give me some nice doses of nostalgia, I spent most of my time with the new arrangements, which were quite a bit smoother than the original soundtrack, but was still able to invoke the original by kind of weaving those sounds into that new arrangement, and it was really nice. For those who really enjoy the art and music side of Final Fantasy, there are a few extras that might interest you. It includes a bestiary, music player, and a place to view concept art for the game. This is definitely a nice addition for those wanting to check out the monster sprites or listen to a certain track. Personally, I've never really used these features that much at games that have them, but it's a nice little addition for those who enjoy such things. In terms of performance, I didn't really experience any issues with the PlayStation 4 version of the game. Everything worked as I would have expected it to, didn't have any crashes or errors or slowdown or anything in my time. It was a really smooth experience. Final Fantasy feels like one of those games that really influenced me as a young gamer. Playing it again in its updated form, I can definitely see why. It has a very solid base, even though there are some aspects of the game that definitely show its age and the limitations that were present when it was made. Personally, I felt this most in the magic system. Not having a traditional MP system is unique, but also felt a bit strange. It also felt a little weird that you could only learn so many spells from each spell level. Admittedly, this wasn't a big deal as certain spells were more useful than others, but it still felt weird to have those limits in place. The other aspect is the weak narrative of the story. While it did create an interesting world and lore, the narrative itself was a bit lacking. Final Fantasy focused more on customization and exploration than it really did on creating characters and a narrative that was super memorable. What's there isn't bad, but it pales in comparison to later games in the series and other RPGs that have come since. All this makes me wonder how newcomers to the series would react to the original Final Fantasy. I'm one who has history with the series and remember playing the original NES version of the game, so there is a bit of nostalgia present that I can't deny. I also tend to be someone who likes seeing how game series have developed over time, so I may enjoy it more than others would. The first Final Fantasy has always held a place in my heart, but admittedly has never been my favorite in the series, except maybe when it was the only one I had ever played. While I do like many of the quality of life additions that the Pixel Remaster brings to the table, the lack of a strong narrative and some dated feeling mechanics lead me to rate Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster an 8 out of 10. That's still a great showing for a game that is almost 40 years old, but it is a bit lacking when compared to some other RPGs out there. Final Fantasy is an iconic series for a reason, and this first game holds up much better than I thought it would for being as old as it is. I was a bit worried that it would be disappointing coming back to it after all this time, but it was still an enjoyable game and one that I would recommend fans of the series or genre to check out.